Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today we are talking about hand traps. It's always a very important topic to look at. I just think with modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! With how crazy combo decks are, if you want to keep them in check, you have to play stuff like hand traps, and they generally will work against most decks just in the game, anyway. So they're a good catch-all, they're a good safe option, but today we're talking about the best hand traps, or somewhat like underrated hand traps going into this upcoming format with Power of the Elements. We're expecting to see a lot of Splight, we're expecting to see a lot of Tearlaments, and so with the addition of these two new decks, a lot of hand traps become better or worse depending on their matchups here. So we'll be going over that. Most of these, by the way, that we're going to be going over are generally referring to Sprite and Tearlaments because I'm expecting them to be like two of the, if not the two most represented decks. I know there's going to be some other decks hanging around, especially if the ban list isn't particularly nasty to the decks we already have, but you have to know, like, Pure Punk seems to be a build rising in contention. Shout out to Pack for that, for being like one of the spearheads on coming up with the ideas for that deck. But that deck's really, really cool. Plays a ton of hand traps. But yeah, whatever. There's other decks, but mostly we're talking about Sprite and Tearlaments for today. So let's just get into this here. Starting off with two honorable mentions before we actually get into the full-on list. Number one, Nibiru. Didn't make the list for me, but I felt like this was something that needed to be said. It seems like everybody's talking hard trash on Nibiru, which I just do not wholly agree with. For a second, I was kind of under the impression that Nib wouldn't be that great, but the argument is Splight, right? First and foremost, Sprite, if they resolve the Exceed monster, it locks both players for the rest of the turn from summoning anything except for rank, link, and level 2 monsters, so you cannot use Nib. But it's important to note that if you're playing this in a list, now, and this is the prerequisite, you have to be playing this in a list that's playing at least 12 plus hand traps in like a 40 card list, or we've seen Punk builds that are 18 hand traps and 50 cards, whatever it is, it has to be a high count. If you see Nib with any other negation type hand trap, you are good to go, because you are going to negate the gigantic Splight and then Nib will crash down the rest of their board. That's the whole goal there. That's the whole thing. I think for that purpose, it's pretty good. If you're going to play with a lot of other hand traps, you can't play it as one of your few and only hand traps. So I think it's better than people give it credit for. I think it'll still see play. I think people will realize it's better than they thought initially. But yeah, it's still an honorable mention for me, not top 5. And then Phantasme, low-key really solid versus Sprite. We know that deck relies on a lot of small monsters. So one, being able to fix your hand to play into their board going second, and also guarantee yourself a 2400 beater, is really good, because you can threaten the elf immediately on your turn, threaten the frog, the toad immediately, right, in the battle phase. Now, they might end on dupe, but it means you only need one other monster to clear the dupe first, and then you can go after stuff. So, depending on the deck you're playing, this could work out great. Also, there's low-key a handful of decks that are abusing Hauk stuff, abusing Dagda stuff, right, that are still super relevant. So, I wouldn't main this just because versus Tearlaments, awful. Same thing with Nib, awful versus Tearlaments, and that's kind of why they don't make the list here. But I do think they're honorable mentions. People probably assume these are garbage and it'll just be phased out of the format completely, but I actually do think they could see some fringe play, for sure, for specific matchups. All right. Number 5 on the list is Ghostbelle and Haunted Mansion. I'll be honest. Number 5 on the list is not impressing me. I think once we get to 4 and above, that's where I'm like, these are solid, hand traps, I think, in the format. Ghostbelle is just, honestly, it holds a specific slot in mind for me, and that is inside of Tearlament decks. You'll see a card earlier, or further up on the list here, is DD Crow. Just spoiler alert. DD Crow messes with Tearlaments very, very hard, because if you remove a Tearlament from grave that's triggering to do a fusion summon, it will not resolve. DD Crow is a very, very powerful card because it just negates a fusion summon, essentially, for the deck. But in Tearlaments, if you play Ghostbelle, not only does it hit something in almost every single deck in the format, I'm not saying it's the most powerful thing, you're not stopping the most powerful cards ever, but it is important to note that you can negate a DD Crow, you can negate a Called by the Grave, or any effect that would be banishing or shuffling back a card from your graveyard. And so for that, I still respect it, and it's decent in the mirror match, it's decent versus Tearlaments. If they're not chain blocking, you could still just stop a fusion summon from grave with it. It hits stuff like Splight Elf. It hits stuff like Ronin Tonin, I believe, just to keep them from getting a ton of materials. It's a one-off negate. Like, we'll take it. But the protection effect made it move up to number 5 for me. Really interesting card in that deck. I think we'll see this a lot played specifically in tier limits because it has that gamma-esqueness where it's like not only a decent hand trap that's going to hit most decks, but it also protects your own stuff from your biggest weakness. So pretty cool. Next up we have Ghost Reaper. Yeah, we haven't seen Ghost Reaper in a long time. This deck has inherent flaws. I'm not here to tell you this is broken. I don't think we're going to see this in a lot of main decks unless you see people go to YCSs probably, where they're expecting to play 7, 8 tier limits in tier limits or like sprites in Swiss. Otherwise, I don't think people are going to want to main deck this. Maybe side deck it for the matchup you're looking for. But listen, if you hit something like Gigantic Sprite, Totally Awesome, or Elf, whichever one you think is the scariest option, it severely limits that deck because what makes sprites so good is that their starting play is go for Gigantic Sprite. When that gets stopped, they pivot into Elf, and then Elf extends them into plays, right? That's what makes them so strong. So by just taking away any of those, it makes one, just limits their ceiling immensely for the rest of the duel. But two, also keeps them from having like grindability, like the fact they won't be able to reestablish fully into the situation they want. I probably wouldn't do it for Gigantic Splight. I think they can have that. So many hand traps stop that anyway, which you could also pair with this card and stop a turn completely. I'd probably go for either Toad or Elf. Without Toad, they don't have that power boss monster to go for. They can play this grindy game and it's like okay, but it's just they're just way weaker and easier to break through. Whereas if you get rid of the Toad, they don't have that boss monster, they don't have the recursion, and they struggle a lot more. You could also get rid of Elf. It takes away their grind game. If you feel confident that like your deck's good at like breaking through that initial situation, taking away Elf takes away their biggest portion of their grind game and follow-up plays. So I kind of like that option as well. And then for tier elements, it's like hitting probably Kit Kalos. That's probably the most important card to hit from them. All in all, but like that one's a little bit weirder. But still, you have to take note that this card probably can't be main decked unless you're going to an event where we know Splight is the most represented deck by far and away, and you're going to play 7, 8 of them or something, like a ton of them. And you can maybe side some like 1 or 2 targets for like other matchups, like tier limits or Punk or something, right? So very interesting card. I think it's pretty powerful in the way you're going to use it because it just fully limits their ceiling for the entire rest of the game, which is really good. So, yeah, but it's just so matchup dependent. So that's why it ended up being still back at number 4 for me. Number 3 is DD Crow. I kind of already mentioned it before when we were talking about Ghost Belle. Tier elements. It's essentially just negating a fusion summon from tier elements. It doesn't care about chain blocking that much. And it's solid versus like everything else. Part of Punk combos is getting stuff in grave, so you can still hinder their situation there. If they like get the Chaotic Dragon plus the Shinobi Necro in grave, you can actually just preemptively banish the Chaotic Dragon. That way he doesn't even get to banish the Shinobi Necro, so they don't get either of those bodies back, which can be a decent piece of like limiting their board. And there's other ways to hit them too. They do some effects that reborn from grave. And then splites, like hitting Ronin Tonin, just clearing that for the entire duel can be absolutely ginormous. Can keep them just off of Toad entirely for the duel, which can be huge. Like I said, kind of same thing as Reaper. If they don't get to Toad, they don't have that high-end crazy boss monster that you have to deal with. And it makes it way more manageable of a matchup. And then Crow, like everything, all the good combo decks now have stuff in the graveyard. So I think Crow is just a pretty good catch-all at not once per turn. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing this at 3 in main decks going forward. But yeah, number 3. Number 2, we got Gamma. Yeah, I think Gamma's really good. Versus Splites, I think it is absolutely just an absolute haymaker. I think one of the biggest things is if Splites start their play by going for either a normal summoned Diva or Beaver, you want to fire this card because not only does it negate them from getting bodies, but now they've lost their normal and they won't even have a body on field. all of the sprite monsters need a level 2 on field, on their side of the field, for them to extend. So by clearing that body off the field, the rest of the sprites are just stuck in hand, so that it forces them to have like exactly a starter in hand follow up. And if they don't, they're in trouble. I guess they could also play like the E-Telly variant, but you usually have to play like more bricks if you do that. So it depends on the variant. But this card can be an absolute haymaker, either negating the gigantic splice if they don't have another body on field, or a normal summon Diva or Beaver can just block up their entire hand. And I think the haymaker aspect of Gamma is just huge. Also, there's a lot of really powerful cards that people are going to be trying to negate currently, like in the game. So if you go for Sprite Starter, people know how crazy that is. They're going to ash it. If you go for Emergency Teleport and you're playing Punk, people are going to ash it. They know how much value that card that card represents. And so being able to respond with Gamma, kind of the same thing as Belle, Inter-Elements, as a protective card as well as an offensive card, is just going to win you duels you have no business winning otherwise. So I really like this card. I'm going to be playing in a lot of different decks. Now, I would try to play it in decks that I like know it has synergy in. Otherwise, I might side it if it doesn't have synergy in my deck. Like I don't have a power spell that's going to be baiting a lot of Ash Blossoms and stuff. Then maybe I'd side it for when I know I'm going second, because obviously seeing it first otherwise is going to be pretty bad. Or I have like a Punk deck where like the synergy with this card is like too good to ignore. But really, really great card in the format, in my opinion. Not the best matchup versus Tearlaments, just because when their cards are sent to the graveyard by card effect, they do usually float. But that doesn't mean there are no targets for this card. There are still solid targets for this card in that deck that you have to respect. And so Gamma's just solid. All right. And the final card, I don't think it should be a surprise to anyone. I talk about this all the time. Shifter is the best hand trap in Yu-Gi-Oh! It just is. I keep saying like, oh, this is a good Shifter format. This is a good Macrocosmos format. Yeah, that's just modern Yu-Gi-Oh, guys. I used to believe that like, wow, we just keep getting formats with all these graveyard decks. That's just modern Yu-Gi-Oh. If Konami wants to make a deck good, they need to be able to play from hand, field, and graveyard. Otherwise, like, you just get outclassed by decks that, like, if you just do hand and field, you're going to get outclassed by a deck that can also use graveyard. They just have other resource pools that you don't have access to, and you're just going to get outclassed. So that's just modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're a good combo deck in 2022, it probably means you use the graveyard. So this craps on Punk. This craps on Tearlaments specifically. Tearlaments can't do anything under this card. And then also Sprites. Sprites can do the most under that out of the three, I think, that I mentioned. But it's still not great. Maybe Punk can do some stuff, but regardless, it's not great. It's not going to be their total insane end board. But even versus Sprites, if they go for a Toad play, if they go for like a Swap Frog play, they're going to lose Ronin Toadin for the whole duel. Elf is going to be turned off for their turn, but even if they make it, it's going to be off for your turn too. So Elf is just like dead, pretty much. And the best they can do is like gigantic Sprite into like a red or a carrot to get like one interruption. And otherwise, like, they're just not doing much at all. So this card is an absolute house versus almost everything in the format. But of course, the drawback with this card is not a lot of decks can afford to play it. In a format where all the best decks use the graveyard, it means none of them can really afford to play this card. So you have to be playing something more like a rogue deck that can afford to play this. I guess I would say Fluanderies is like probably more tier 2 than rogue, but like Fluanderies is one of the highest level decks that can play this card, and it's one of the few reasons they have a good chance in the format regardless, because they're one of the few decks that just has a blowout that even if they go second, you probably just pass if you're playing a meta deck. Is a big reason. So not a lot of decks can play this, but if you can, it gives you a huge leg up in the format we're heading into. But yeah, those are my top 5 hand traps. Dimension Shifter at number 1, Gamma at number 2, Crow at 3, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries at 4, and Ghost Belle at 5. I also left Ash Blossom off this list because at best, Ash versus like Tearlaments is like stopping 1 mil. That's it. And versus Splight, it's like, I guess it hits starter, so it's like kind of the same as like hitting E-Telly. But like outside of that, like negating a blue, negating a jet, once they're already on the field, like they already got the extender. You made them take a 1-for-1 instead of a -1 or anything. So like that's really bad. You're just going -1. Same thing with Gigantic Sprite. If you negate him with Ash, I guess it's fine. That's probably the best target overall to hit. Or maybe like a normal summon swap. No, that's bad because they can just reborn it and send run again. I guess it's gigantic sprite, so they're usually always going to save it for that. But if they have a good hand, they're going to set up a protection for that anyway. So I don't like a card that only has one great target in a deck, or one or two depending on the hand. So I just felt Ash is like mediocre. People will still play it just because it's still a hit everything kind of hand trap. No matter the matchup, no matter whatever, it'll hit something. So they like that reliability. I just don't think it's hitting anything too particularly strong or doing anything. It's not winning duels in this format, in my opinion. So yeah, but that's it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. As always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more stuff from your boy down the line, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your favorite hand trap. If you disagree with where I have everything listed here, if you think a hand trap is better or worse than I have it listed, feel free to let me know in the comments. But I'll see you in the next one. Peace.